Hello everyone, my name is Jacqui Gilbourne and I'm here today on behalf of Renua Ireland and our Zero Tolerance campaign, which is dedicated to the protection of children. I want to say that regardless of ideology or political affiliation, the core driver of this campaign is the protection of children, of all children. With regard to Renua's Zero Tolerance campaign, we are looking at the new proposals for changes to the school curriculum on early sex education. These proposals have already been implemented in England, in Europe and in the United States. Renua believes these proposals to be abusive to children and therefore opposes them. With this in mind, I'm speaking with Dr. Miriam Grossman. Dr. Grossman is a medical doctor with training in paediatrics and in the speciality of child, adolescent and adult psychiatry. She has written several books, one of which is called Unprotected: A Psychiatrist Reveals How Political Correctness in Her Profession Harms Every Student. And her second book, You're Teaching My Child What? A Physician Exposes the Lies of Sex Education. Dr. Grossman, it is a pleasure to have you here with us today to speak on this fundamental issue of child protection.
Thank you, Jacqui, for having me. What happened is that I worked for 12 years at a student counseling center of one of the best universities in my country, UCLA, the University of California in Los Angeles. And I was a psychiatrist there in the counseling center. We were very, very busy. And in those 12 years, I'm sure I saw thousands of patients, mostly young women. And I never initially, I didn't used to ask or really take a sexual history when I saw students. In other words, we had kind of a standard intake form, which would need to be completed, that asked, standard questions about why a patient had come in and their history, their, drug use, their family history, medical history. But in the medical history, there was nothing about a sexual history. So there was nothing about sexually transmitted diseases or number of partners, abortions, and so on. So I never really got to that. It wasn't even in my mind to ask about that. And none of the other psychiatrists either. It was just not a standard thing. And then what happened is, after a few years, the system of record keeping in the counseling center became electronic instead of on paper. And so because it was electronic, we now had access to not only the records from our center, but the records from the health center. Okay, so the health center, physical health, was separate in a different building altogether from the counseling center. And never before had we had access to the medical history on patients unless we called and asked, which, I would only do under specific circumstances. So what I started doing, since I had access to the patient's health history, before I would see somebody new, I would spend a few minutes looking at their visits to the health center and what they were for. And I was quite surprised to see how many patients had gone into the health center because of a sexually transmitted infection, or they wanted a pregnancy test, or they they needed a referral for an abortion. And it was really quite a surprise to me because, like I said, I had never explored that area of their lives before this. And so I started to include that in my evaluation of patients. And that's when I discovered the tremendous emotional impact that sexual decisions had on my patients. And as I began to explore this and ask them more, they would open up on subjects that previously they had never, I guess, felt comfortable, or maybe they didn't think it was relevant to tell me that, yes, they, had a sexually transmitted infection, they had herpes, or they had an abnormal pap smear and, pre-cancer of the cervix, and that they, this had been a very distressing event in their lives, and they were still worried about it, or perhaps they had an abortion, and that had brought up a lot of issues for them, and it had impacted their mental health and their academic functioning. Because if you become, if you have an emotional crisis over something, and I'm not saying that having a herpes or another infection is necessarily an emotional crisis for everybody, but it is for a lot of people. And I'm not saying that an abortion is necessarily a crisis for every single person, but it sure is for a lot of people, both women and men.
That's a message that doesn't come across half strong enough, I think, Miriam. The mental disturbance of abortion, I think that message doesn't get out for women strong enough, how damaging it can be to the quality of their lives.
Absolutely. It is whitewashed, like so many things, because it doesn't go along with the agenda, which we're going to get to soon, explaining what the agenda is here. The emotional consequences of abortions, sexually transmitted infections, and the breakup of romantic relationships in which an attachment has occurred can be emotionally devastating. And what I'm saying is that the students that I was seeing at UCLA, they were very bright, very ambitious. They had worked hard to get into that university, and they had dreams. I mean, they had career dreams and relationship dreams. And what I was finding is that often their sexual decisions ended up impacting their grades, their ability to write their thesis, their ability to accomplish what they wished to accomplish. And by the time they got into my office, you see, there wasn't really anything I could do for them. I could just listen and be there and, hand them tissues. And I promise you, we used up a lot of tissues in my office.
Yeah, I think the attachment that females have in a relationship is very different, especially during adolescence, I think, or like at early college days. I think that women put a hell of a lot more emphasis on the relationship and the input and the value it has to their lives. I mean, am I right in saying that? So there is increased damage and threat to them.
The way that I like to put it is that they have increased vulnerability. And there is science now. There's incredibly interesting science that I write about in my books about attachment and about girls and women being, more likely to attach quicker. But to get back to your question of just telling you a little bit about myself and how all this happened, I felt very frustrated as a doctor to not be able to do anything except listen and give my patients boxes of tissues. That's not why I became a doctor. And so through conversations that I had with my patients and explaining to them things that they had never known before about sexually transmitted infections and about attachment and about abortion, I told them that, well, I don't know if I told them, but I certainly thought to myself that their suffering was 100% avoidable. If they had just been educated and informed properly, they may have made different decisions, and they may have been spared all this anguish that they were going through. And when I would tell them, for example, about oxytocin and how oxytocin is released during sexual behavior, and it tells the brain to attach, and it tells the brain to trust the person that you're with, and they'd say to me, like, I didn't know that. Why didn't anybody tell me that? Dr. Grossman, you have to go out, write a book. Okay, you have to go out and tell people this. Other young people need to know. They're not being told in their schools, in their sex education about this. And that was the beginning of my, I could say I became an activist. From that experience with so many students, I became an activist, and I wrote my book that you mentioned, Unprotected, because I felt that young women, especially on campus, but of course also in high school, were just unprotected and vulnerable. And that the reason they were so unprotected and vulnerable was in part due to my profession failing them. My profession, the medical profession and the mental health profession, failing young people. And I was fired up about it. I was angry. I'm still angry. And so I wrote Unprotected, and after that, I was motivated to study what's being told younger kids in sex education classes. And I was shocked to see what kids are being told. And I wrote this book, You're Teaching My Child What? And essentially, I discovered that sexuality education is not about health. It's about ideology. So that's my short version of the background of how I got into all this.
Yes. So you see now the trends in sex education, in the type of education that's being rolled out now in the US and in Europe and England. Can you give us an overview of those trends now that these have happened in the last few years? What do you think about these trends?
Sure. Well, and things are getting progressively more radical, but in the past few years, but this really all started, much longer ago, that sexuality education became a vehicle to, and I'm going to say indoctrinate. I know that that's a strong word to use, but I really do believe that it qualifies as indoctrination, because indoctrination is the bombardment of people with certain ideas over and over and over again, without any opportunity to question those ideas. And the ideas are presented as if they are fact. So this is precisely what has been going on. And sexuality education, or comprehensive sexuality education, or I guess in Ireland you call it what do you call it there?
RSE, Relationship and Sexuality Education.
Yeah, RSE, yeah, is really about sexual rights and sexual freedom, meaning that students are told from a very young age that they are sexual creatures from cradle to grave, and that from cradle to grave they have the right to express their sexuality and to act on their sexuality in whatever way they want. And whether they choose to take certain risks or not is up to them. And that no one can judge them and tell them, that these things are too dangerous for you, or you should delay sexual behavior until later, because that would be imposing on the person's sexual human rights. It became it was brought into the human rights arena and taken out of the health arena, because you see, Jacqui, you can't at the same time have sexual freedom and preserve your sexual rights. Because if you're going to have early initiation into sexual behavior at a young age, and then multiple partners and experimentation, that will likely jeopardize your sexual health. Okay, it's well known in medicine, and that a risk factor, the number one risk factor for sexually transmitted infections, which can be lifelong and lead to infertility, cancer, and other awful things, that the number one risk factor is early initiation of sexual behavior in girls, and I'll explain why later, and number of partners. So you see, you can't have both. If it's a message of sexual health, there's really just one. It's a very simple message, it's a very easy, clear message, and that is delay sexual behavior until you're an adult, and ideally until you're married, and ideally find somebody that also delayed sexual behavior, and then get together with them in a lifetime monogamous relationship. Now, I know that sounds like it's all about morality and the Bible and so on, but you know what? The reality, the biology affirms those traditional values.
Well,
biology.
There are consequences to behavior. There are consequences from actions. And it's like the adults have let the children down by not telling them, that they will be damaged by this behavior. It's just let them do whatever they like without telling them. But you wouldn't give a 5-year-old a glass of Guinness, or even an 8-year-old. You just wouldn't give them alcohol.
Well, of course.
And yet,
in every other area of health, of course, in every other area of health, I mean, think about it. How do we approach drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, tanning salons, diet and exercise? We give a very straightforward, strong, medical approach. This is not healthy for you. Do not smoke. Okay, we don't say, well, it's really up to you. If you have the right to enjoy it, and it's an appetite. You see, the healthy, if sexuality education was really health-based, we would be saying, look, all of us are born with certain appetites. And the sexual appetite is a healthy, wonderful appetite. But like all appetites, it has to be restrained. You can't expect to, if you're focused on your freedom and rights in terms of your, what if it was your appetite to eat, or your appetite to take drugs or drink, and you were focused on your rights and your freedom in that area? Well, that would lead to a lot of illness and a lot of bad stuff. So we tell people, you have to practice self-discipline. You have to watch what you eat. You have to limit, your drinking. You have to limit your exposure to the sun. You may love the beach, but you have to take certain steps, and you have to limit your you know what I'm talking about, in all these areas. But in the area of sexual health, all we find is this idea, this notion of using protection. That you can basically be sexually active, have multiple partners, experiment from an early age, just use protection and get tested.
Yes.
And those are not adequate.
Or use a vaccine.
Measures.
You can use a vaccine too, the HPV vaccine.
And the vaccine,
Yes.
correct.
Yes. So yes. And how this relates to very young children then, bringing this into schools, into 4 to 5 year olds and talking to them, about, I mean, the curriculum is already in place where it's acknowledged that children aren't stupid, they're really intelligent and they know how their bodies are and they know who they are in their childlike way. But to bring this in, and deliberately talk to them, and I've watched videos and children are shocked, by what they're shown, and it's an adult value imposed on a small child. And the morality of it is quite shocking, but also the damage to the child, you think, are you taking away their innocence and their, childhood?
Well, I believe it's a deliberate attack on innocence. I believe that the plan is to chip away at a child's inborn innocence and sense of embarrassment. Those really are precious things that we need to honor and we need to protect. Instead, the sexuality educators want to introduce ideas and images to very young students, and to accustom them to the notion that school is the place where we talk about such things, so that the child, and in an environment where there's both boys and girls. So, for example, every sexuality education curriculum will say that kids as young as 5 or 6 must be taught the proper names for their genitalia. Now, I have no objection if parents want to do this at home. I have no problem with that, in the privacy of their own home with their parents. But to do this in school, where kids are surrounded by their friends, they're with their teacher, I don't know what other agenda the teacher may have. But Jacqui, I'm wondering, how do you teach a child, where their penis and scrotum are and their vulva and vagina if you do not have some sort of diagram or image of that? I don't know how they're doing that. I've looked into it. I don't know precisely what's being used there, but that's problematic if they're being shown images. What these sexuality educators claim is that it's necessary to do this because it prevents child abuse. But their argument does not hold up. What they further say is that it's important that children know the specific names of the different areas of their genitalia so that they will be able to recognize if someone touches them in those areas. Otherwise, they won't know that they've been abused and that they need to report it, which is absurd. All they need to be told is that no one is allowed, aside from if they're getting a bath and their parents are bathing them or the doctor's examining them, no one is allowed to ask to see or touch those areas that are covered by your bathing suit. That's it.
And any child gets that. Most children get that. That's all you need. We were children once, we got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's why I say that there's more going on here. They want to introduce to children, they want children to be comfortable, to chip away at their embarrassment at discussing these issues at school and in a sort of public forum with a teacher that they really may not know at all, so that their embarrassment and their innocence is chipped away. And that later, a few years later, when they bring up much more graphic and disturbing information, they will, it will be easier for them to accept it and to just think, you know, this is what you talk about in school. You don't only learn history and multiplication, you talk about all these private issues.
So it's a grooming, it's a kind of grooming, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. It's very sad, really, that people are so myopic.
I read the other day that 10% of sexual assaults on children occur at the hands of school employees. And, you know, sexuality has definitely has a foothold in our schools, in our high schools, obviously, but in our elementary schools and even in our, you know, in with the kindergarten and very young. So this is a dangerous ideology. This does not belong in school.
Where do you think this ideology comes from? What do you think is the basis for this? Is it that later grooming? Is it the acceptance of abortion, the acceptance of a very...
Yes, well, you know, if you look into the history, which I do in my books and also on my website, which is miriamgrossmanmd.com, if people are really interested in looking into the history of sexuality education and Kinsey, it all started back in the 50s with an ideological movement to convince society that, again, to impose this ideology of sexual freedom and sexual rights. It's an attack on Judeo-Christian morality. It's an attack on the family. It's an attack on marriage. And so you have to start early, like in all ideologies. You have to start very early with young children, and you have to present your ideology in a way that sounds very noble and very positive, and say that you know, Judeo-Christian ideology or Judeo-Christian concepts about sex and marriage and male and female are repressive, and they oppress people and people suffer because of it, and therefore we need a new way of looking at things. And the new way of looking at things is that actually people are sexual from birth, from cradle to grave, and that children are sexual and children enjoy sexuality. Kinsey was a pedophile, and the people around him were pedophiles. And so this continues, you know, to this day, the effort to normalize and to legitimize and make legal the sexual assault of children by convincing people that kids enjoy it and that there's nothing wrong with it. So that is what's behind all this ideology. It's very dangerous. And like I said before, I just want to emphasize, because I do not come, aside from explaining how biology affirms traditional values of family and marriage and sex and male and female, aside from saying that, all of my writing is based on health and medicine. So I do not come from the perspective of the church, the synagogue. I mean, I'm an Orthodox Jew, okay, but that I am writing as a doctor, and all my books and all my work is presents the science, what you see under the microscope, and how that promotes traditional values and traditional ways of thinking about sexuality and male and female, etc.
But isn't this a huge message that you're speaking about, and we're speaking about, that your health, you have no life if you have no health. You can't live a successful life. You can't be okay. So
Jacqui, I know of people who have committed suicide following having terrible sexually transmitted infections, so that they, I know of a student who couldn't walk because his herpes was so bad and his genitals were, covered, and he was so shamed and embarrassed and filled with guilt. And herpes is something that you carry for the rest of your life.
But this is so serious. Why do people not listen to this wisdom? Why do they not get it? That the damage that can be caused.
Because in sexuality education, the damage is whitewashed. They don't tell these stories of the pain and suffering that can come from just after one encounter. Okay, you don't get lung cancer after smoking one cigarette. You would think from the way, look, I'm not, I'm the last person in the world that would, would defend a habit of smoking cigarettes. However, you can smoke one cigarette and you're not at risk for a deathly lifelong illness. You can have one sexual encounter with a condom and come down with herpes or warts or HIV from one encounter. And I've seen people from one encounter, their whole life is now changed. And their whole life it becomes, who now will be my sexual partner? Do I tell them? Should I tell the truth? And if I don't tell the truth and they get it from me, then what? And marriages break up that way. Because I know of one case where a man didn't tell his wife that he had had herpes years ago, and they were married and expecting a child, and in the middle of the pregnancy, she developed herpes, because it can pass with, you can shed the virus without having the symptoms. And so in the middle of the pregnancy, she got herpes, and she assumed that her husband had been unfaithful, and you can imagine what kind of crisis that was. So many casualties of this lifestyle, and yet it continues, and so we have to warn young people, and we have to reject these curricula that are focused on sexual rights and sexual freedom instead of sexual health.
And what is the parents' role? Where do you see parents being empowered?
Parents have a primary role. They must educate their kids. They must reach their children first. And even though in their own lives, in their own histories, they may have lived or made choices that they're not proud of right now, that's fine. We all have choices that we're not proud of. But now they have an opportunity to tell their kids, and if their kids are aware of some of the regretful errors in lifestyle that the parents made, that's also okay. A parent's job is to sit down with the child and say, look, I made these mistakes. And so, it's like if I knew that there had been this cliff in front of me, that I was about to walk off a cliff, I mean, no one warned me, but I'm here to warn you. That's my job. And I love you so much. And I want so much for you to have a good life and a healthy life. And I don't want you to have the regrets that I now have about my life.
You would think that parents would be up in arms. This is their precious child, the most precious thing that they will ever come to them, their children. So you would think they would be...
Of course, but parents don't realize. Parents trust educators. Parents trust what they're being told, that comprehend that sexuality education is going to tell your kids everything that they need to know. That's not true. It's not. They tell the parents that it's going to urge your child to delay sexual behavior. No, they don't necessarily do that. They may hint at it, but really it's about telling them, you decide. You have the right to decide. And they don't tell them about what we were just speaking about, the horrific consequences of sexually transmitted infections and abortion. And they don't tell them the science. Okay, let's go through that list right now. All the things that kids are not told, that are omitted from what we call in our country comprehensive sexuality education. Okay, so number one is that they're not told, girls are not informed that they are more vulnerable physically and emotionally to early sexual behavior and multiple partners. So the reason that girls are more vulnerable physically, aside from obviously being the one that gets pregnant, is because the cervix, the entrance to the uterus, is in girls, the covering of the cervix is very vulnerable to infection because it only is one cell thick. As a girl matures into adulthood, that area becomes much tougher and covered with many cells. But when a girl is 12 or 13 or 15, that cervix is extremely delicate. And if there's a virus or a bacteria there, chlamydia, gonorrhea, human papillomavirus, or herpes, it's very easy for that cervix to be infected. And men or boys don't have an equivalent area like that, unless we're talking about anal intercourse, which we can get to later. It's a different subject. But just getting back to girls and women represent 80% of all the morbidity, the sickness, and the suffering from sexually transmitted infections outside of HIV, which is more common in men who have sex with men. So girls are not told about their immature cervix. And that's very, very important. It's something that no. Because it would go, you see, Jackie, it would go against this notion that's also part of sexuality education, that men and women, male and female, girls and boys, really are the same. They're at the same risk. If they had to point out that girls are at more risk, that would sound sexist. That's not fair, right? Biology isn't fair. Biology is sexist, okay? Biology says that girls are more vulnerable, and that's the way it always was, and that's the way it's always going to be. Correct. It's biology. It's not, your parents being sexist to tell when they give the boys a different message than the girls. I mean, look, boys are certainly also at risk, and then kids should all be given the same guidance about delaying sexual behavior. But the truth is that girls are more at risk, and they need to know about it. The other thing that kids are not told about is the biochemistry of attachment. And by the way, just getting back to the cervix, immature cervix, and the biochemistry of attachment, these are things that we've known about for decades and decades in science.
But aren't they inherent? They're inherent for our protection to survive as a species. They're built into us.
They are. The body has its own wisdom, and this is part of the body's wisdom. But again, Jacqui, you see, it goes against the ideology of sexual freedom and sexual rights. Because if you're going to be sexually free and have many partners, including strangers and all sorts of varieties of sexual encounters, you can't then go tell people that, oh, well, science actually shows us that you might get attached to those people and you might think about them later. You may, that sex is more than just an act of pleasure. It's an act of attachment. It's an act that brings emotional attachment and trust. And we know that now because we've studied the hormone oxytocin, which is primarily a female hormone, actually, although men have it as well. And I'm not saying that men and boys don't get attached to their sexual partners, because they obviously do. We just know that oxytocin is primarily a female hormone, and that a hormone is a chemical that is released from one organ and goes to another organ. So in the case of oxytocin, when there's sexual touching and stimulation, touching of the breasts, kissing, gazing into the eyes of someone that you feel affection toward, all these activities cause the release of oxytocin, and the oxytocin goes to the brain, and it says to the brain, this is someone you can trust. This is someone that you can relax and get attached to. And you don't have to be afraid, and you don't have to be cautious. That's the message that the brain gets. Now, this is not the message that you want the brain to get when you're with someone that you hardly know. You're with someone just on a one-off, what used to be called a one-night stand, casual sex, all the sexual behaviors that are part of sexual freedom and sexual rights. Your body is saying no. Your body is saying, preserve this specific kind of behavior, is special. And it sends the brain certain messages. And I would tell my students this, and again, they would just say, wow, like, why didn't I know this? That, especially the young women who would come in after hooking up, it used to be called hooking up, with someone multiple times, and the person really, the guy was just using her for his sexual pleasure, and lo and behold, she really had developed feelings toward the person, and she wanted to get to know him and go out and talk, and the guy just wasn't interested. And again, I would explain about the hormones and about just the special nature of sexual touching. And again, she'd say, well, why didn't anyone tell me that? But if you look at these curricula, and I'm certain that the curricula that you are talking about, that you have now in Ireland, does not. If at best they might have one sentence and say, and say, look, some people do get attached during sexual behavior, but then they'll go on once again and promote sexual freedom and early sexual behavior when you're ready. Their big message is no one can tell you when you're ready. Only you know when you're ready.
Yes, and then when there is mental, psychological damage, what our supports are in place. You know, they let this happen and then they throw girls to the wolves. You know, there's nobody there to listen. I mean, you're there for your patients, but here in Ireland, mental health is not very well supported.
You were saying that there's no support. You know, I agree with you, and I want your listeners to, I highly suggest that your listeners to this interview go online and search for the support groups that exist online for people who have herpes or other STDs, HPV, and they go on those support groups and see the tens of thousands of people that are turning online with their shock and their anger and their guilt. And they're there supporting each other. And in fact, what exists now are groups in which people are turning in order to find their sexual partners to find somebody else who also has an STD. Now, this is very, very sad. And I agree with you that we don't have enough support. You know, in the counseling center where I worked, there were support groups for everything under the sun. People who had eating disorders or substance abuse disorders, or people who, for example, after Trump was elected, they would have special places for support to deal with the emotional fallout from that, and you know, people who with family issues, you name it.
And I imagine after 9/11 there would have been support groups, massive support.
Oh yes, after 9/11, sure, after natural disasters. But what about support groups for people who feel that they need one after an abortion or after being diagnosed with a sexually transmitted infection and just learning to cope with it and how to deal with it? Like, who do I tell? What do I do with this information? How do I move on from this to my next relationship? No groups for that.
And to go back to your initial, you know, this is needless suffering, you know. It doesn't have to happen. If kids are educated properly, you know, if they're given the information, while older children and younger ones are treated with great kindness and compassion, then this doesn't have to happen. It's like society needs to wake up. I hate to use that word because it's been so mangled lately, but you know, to become aware of how important it is to be informed and to know the story, to know the score and the risks involved.
The thing is, it goes against the agenda. So that the people that are bringing into schools, into kindergartens, cross-dressers or transgender individuals or what have you, to talk about their experience, those same people would not want someone to come in and speak to older kids. I'm not saying to the little kids, the older kids, someone who has suffered from having herpes, someone who has HIV that regrets their behavior, someone who's had an abortion and it's impacted their whole life. They would be totally, they would block that. They wouldn't permit that from happening. They would say that that's an agenda and that's to scare kids.
So they're stopping a real education. They're stopping an education that would benefit people. They're stopping that.
They're stopping anything that goes counter to their ideology, that they want the kids to be indoctrinated that sexuality, that kids are sexual from cradle to grave, and that they have the right and the freedom to exercise and express that sexuality.
And
Yeah.
when we come to online images and other media where sexual images are displayed, does the education system have a responsibility in counteracting that? Phones in schools, or again, you can sit down and talk to the children. Parents and teachers can come in and really campaign for children not to be able to watch this stuff, which is adult stuff.
You're talking about pornography. Of course. Of course, it's the responsibility of parents and schools to sit down with their children from a young age. I mean, before they get a screen in front of them, even. And to say, these devices, they can be really great and fun, and you can learn so much from these devices, but there's also there's bad stuff on these devices. There's scary stuff, and there's stuff that no one should be looking at, because it's bad for your brain and it's bad for your heart. And so kids need to hear that from an early age. And there's now tons and tons of evidence about the harm to adults, let alone young people, certainly, of seeing graphic sexual material. And there are wonderful organizations out there that will help parents and educators in that fight.
And it also objectifies women, and undermines women. They're objects, to be used, which is,
of course,
dreadful,
Of course. But what I thought that you might be referring to, Jacqui, at first when you brought that up, was the graphic images in sex education.
Well, that too. And then the phones are there, the screens are there to corroborate that, instead of giving a different message, not showing those graphic images and warning parents and children not to watch this stuff online. Surely that would be the message to go out.
Correct. But, when we were speaking about doing this interview not long ago, and I emailed you some images that were very graphic and very disturbing, and they came from one of the most popular sexuality education books for kids. And I wanted to show them on this this interview, and you said no, you can't show those images. Now, isn't that the most shocking thing of all, that material created by educators, so-called educators, who are in our schools and in our homes, and parents are led to believe that this is wonderful for kids to see. Well, you remember the kinds of things that I sent you. They were very, very graphic.
Yes. Like a manual of how to. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
It's like giving kids a manual on how to be so liberal, and that it's okay and anything goes. And here are the instructions, here's how you can do it.
And then once you've seen something, our sense of vision is different than hearing, or if you read something. Vision, you get that image, you can never erase it. And so this is a process, again, of chipping away at a child's innocence and chipping away at their sense of embarrassment, and which are precious things that we should be protecting. A child has, in child development, we learn about all the challenges that children face, and just the normal challenges to learn how to walk and talk and use the bathroom and get along with their siblings and with friends, and deal with parents who say, no, you can't touch this, you can't have this, with their own urges. They have to learn self-control. There's so much to deal with. And then they go out in the world and they have to deal with, with school and those are normal challenges. What about the challenges of family problems and parents who might have substance abuse issues and COVID and everyone has a mask? I mean, there's so many challenges that children have, and what we're doing with sexuality education is putting on them a burden that they are not prepared or wired to cope with. They don't have the maturity in terms of their brain maturity and their emotional maturity to deal with the material that's being put in front of them. 5-year-olds being told, that a girl can really be a boy, and a boy is really a girl, and these are and all the concepts of sexuality and
I don't believe that children are even thinking about these things hardly. I don't know where they get their information from.
They need to be using all their energy, children do, and their time, to be developing normally and to be dealing with everyday normal challenges that I mentioned to you before, and there's many more of them. What about a child, a special needs child? What about a child who has challenges in development, like being on the autism spectrum, and has to deal with not understanding social cues and not being able to communicate their needs? Children like that are at increased risk, and you're going to throw all this stuff at them at an early age. It's simply wrong. This is a war.
Yes, just to tell you, there was a case recently in England, the Kira Bell case, where at 16 she was given hormone drugs to try.
I know about it.
Yes.
Yes.
So she won her case, where they ruled that a 16-year-old was not capable of making a life-changing decision like that. That's a 16-year-old, never mind coming back to 4 and 5-year-olds. I mean, they're not.
That was a very, very positive development. And everyone that's fighting this war for children was pleased with that ruling. Unfortunately, in other places, in Canada, there's a law that's up right now, legislation that will make it legal to remove kids from a family that refuses to honor a child's wish to be called by opposite sex pronouns. That child can legally be removed from the home. So again, I mean, this is, well, not again, because I didn't say it before, but this is about the recruitment of young people away from their families and into this radical ideology.
And it's consent. I mean, the whole issue of consent, and is it properly approached? I mean, I would imagine that consent should be taught outside of sexuality altogether, and it would be around bullying, which is rampant in schools, and that children would be taught to respect the space of another in that way, and then the child would understand better, around, yes, I will do that, no, I won't do that. You would think it would come from I would have thought it would have come from that angle if they're talking about consent. Consent,
well, this is more of the same thing. I mean, it sounds very, very right and noble to be teaching kids about consent. However, at the same time, when they're teaching them about sexual freedom and sexual rights, and they're also teaching them that only they know when they want to begin having sexual encounters, and the notion that a young person can give consent full consent for a sexual encounter that has the potential of changing their entire life. Because from one sexual encounter, like I said, there can be a pregnancy or a sexually transmitted infection or HIV. The notion that teenagers whose brain is still immature, and we need to get into that as well, because the brain is immature. And we know this in neuropsychology and neuropsychiatry and neurobiology. This has been known for decades. The brain is immature in a teenager. And what that means is that the part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is right behind the forehead, it's the last part of the brain to mature. And it's the part of the brain that is in charge of executive functioning, making good decisions, considering all your options, considering consequences.
Do you think there is a delay in that development among our educators and our policymakers? Because I think they're immature. I think they don't know how to make mature decisions that are for the well-being of children.
I mean, the notion of saying that a teenager can give consent and can make wise decisions based on just the fact that they have all this information about consent, and they have information about preventing pregnancy using condoms. What we know is that in the moment of stimulation, which could be sexual stimulation or other kinds of stimulation, driving a car really quickly, or being offered drugs or other high stimulating situations. I mean, what do teenagers, after they've made a poor decision and they're sitting with their parents the next day, and the parents say to them, what were you thinking when you did that last night? When you were driving 80 miles an hour, or you smoked weed, or you did some other nutty thing. What were you thinking after all we've talked about? And what does the kid say? I guess I wasn't thinking, right? But it's true. Their brain it's true. They're under a high stimulus situation. The lower part of the brain, not the prefrontal cortex, which thinks rationally like an adult, hopefully like an adult, the lower area of the brain, which is more based in emotions and impulsiveness and reward and pleasure, it takes over. It takes over, that's all. That's what happens. And instead of telling kids that they, that they can make wise decisions, and they just need tons of information, and so we're going to give you all this information about different kinds of condoms and how you put it on, and we're going to have this replica of an erect penis in front of you, and we're going to show you how to put that condom on, which takes 13 steps of, first you have to have the condom, right? Now, these are kids who don't remember to bring their pencil to school. Okay, first you have to have the condom. Second, you have to make sure that it's not expired, that you have to check the date. Yeah, right. They're in the middle of a potentially sexually encounter, right? And they're about to have intercourse. Okay, yeah, sure. They're going to really check to see if that condom, had the date is not expired. And then they have to open it properly, and they have to they have to handle the condom so that it doesn't break, and it has to put on properly. Are you kidding me? It's a joke. These are teenagers. Which is why the numbers of STIs continue to explode. Now, the number of pregnancies in adolescents has gone down in the United States. We don't know if that's because there's less intercourse or more use of condoms, or because there's more use of next day contraception. So those are all possibilities. But to lead parents and teenagers to think that this is a plan to give kids condoms and to trust that in the heat of the moment they're going to make the right decision, and they're going to, oh, we're talking about consent. So in the heat of the moment, yeah, right, you have, let's say, you have a 17-year-old guy with a 14-year-old girl, and they're in the midst of preparing for a sexual encounter, and then the 17-year-old is going to be able to figure out if this girl is really giving complete, wholehearted consent for this activity. And the girl is really necessarily is going to be able to have the strength and the wherewithal and the wisdom and the maturity to say, stop, I don't want to go forward now. It's just, they're not living in reality.
Just a last question, Miriam, before we finish up. There's a campaign in Ireland to force denominational schools to teach sex education without regard to the religious beliefs of those schools. The view seems to be that faith and sex education do not mix. What is your view on that? Or do you have a view on that?
Oh, I would say that the contrary of that is the truth. Faith and sex education absolutely do mix. Absolutely, because if the faith message is to honor the innocence of children and to teach teenagers about the sexual appetite being something that is special, and that the way to have the healthiest and happiest sexual life as an adult is to wait till adulthood. And there's plenty of research, Jacqui, that shows that young people who do wait until adulthood have the best sexual relationships. There's one study I saw recently that showed that people who initiated sexual behavior at 19 or older than 19, they that were currently in a sexual relationship, either married or not, they ranked their degree of happiness in that sexual relationship much higher in terms of trust, compatibility, sexual satisfaction, and just general happiness with the relationship. These are people that postponed sexual behavior until they were 19 or older. And so the message that communities of faith give to young people, well, traditional faith, give to young people about postponing sexual behavior, and they underscore the unique qualities of a sexual relationship, and they talk about attachment and they talk about the ideal, and it is an ideal. It's a difficult ideal, but it is one that we should be promoting to young people and encouraging them to strive toward the ideal of waiting until marriage, the same way that we tell young people, to strive toward the ideal of exercising regularly and avoiding substances and all the other things that we tell them, not to smoke and not to eat junk food and not to eat too much sugar, all those things which are really hard because we're surrounded by junk food and sugar and delicious things to eat.
Yes, temptation is everywhere, isn't it?
Yes.
Temptation is everywhere, but it
Yes.
erodes the self-confidence. You give into it, your self-confidence just disappears. You don't know who you are anymore. Jordan Peterson speaks so eloquently about responsibility, you know, and that's what empowers you. Clean up your room, he says, you know. So when you do things that are beneficial to yourself, you're empowered inside, and you feel, as you say, happy. You know, happy.
Of course. So the question is, why do sexuality and health educators have that approach toward every other appetite except the sexual appetite? In every other area, they have that approach. You can do it. It's hard, but it's worth it. You'll benefit from keeping a healthy weight. You'll benefit from not eating all that junk. You'll benefit from exercising every day. You can do it. But they would never say all that stuff about sex, because in that area, they're promoting their ideology of freedom and rights. That's why. So I believe that in faith-based schools, that's a wonderful place to bring in all the science about attachment and about the brain and the body of a teenager being too immature. It's a great place to bring that out.
Yeah. Okay. It's so good to speak to you today, Miriam. I'm just wondering where can people contact you or get your books? Are they available on Amazon or whereabouts?
Sure. I've actually written 4 books. Aside from the 2 that I mentioned, which are specifically about this subject, the unprotected, a campus psychiatrist reveals how political correctness in her profession endangers every student. And this is the one where I tell, each chapter is the story of a student that was harmed, drastically harmed by information that she or he was not given. And how they were led to believe that they could behave in their personal life in ways that they end up paying a price. And then you're teaching my child what goes through the lies of sex education and how they harm children. And that includes a chapter on transgenderism, which is true more than ever right now. And then I also wrote a book. All these books are available on Amazon. I wrote a book many, many years ago for girls girls whose bodies are changing, that their parents should give to them before they have their first period. And it's written for Jewish girls, but to my surprise, it's been very popular also, you know, for anyone really, because it's written in a very innocent way, in an empowering way, and in a way that, you know, it doesn't give any more or less information that a 11-year-old, 10 or 11-year-old girl would need. That's called The Wonder of Becoming You. And I mean, I have a copy, obviously, but anyway, it's also been translated into 4 languages, but that's available on Amazon, The Wonder of Becoming You. And then finally, a few years ago, I wrote a book for children called The Black and White Puppy. And that's on Amazon as well. And that is a book for very little children it's about the special relationship. Well, let me say this first. I wanted to counter the message that kids are getting at an early age of girls and boys like that, blurring the distinctions between male and female. The message that says there's nothing special about biological parents, the nuclear biological family. all you need is two people who love you. Because the truth is, there is an ideal. There is an ideal family. I'm not saying that there may be other family structures that are wonderful and healthy, but the ideal family for a child is to be raised by both biological parents. And so the book, The Black and White Puppy, I'm sorry, I should have had it right here ready to show to you, but it emphasizes and it presents the biology, the unique biology of mother and actually unborn child. It talks about a boy whose dog has puppies, and how those puppies have a unique relationship with their mother through nursing and other things. And then from that, I extrapolate onto the unique relationship between the boy's mother and father and himself. I also talk about how cuddling is very special, and you're not going to want to cuddle with someone that is a stranger, because it tells your brain to trust that person and to love that person. So basically, what The Black and White Puppy introduces ideas to little kids through a children's book that will then hopefully protect them against the ideas that they might be exposed to later on. Because parents can build on those ideas and remind the child as the child matures. Remember in Black and White Puppy how you learned about cuddling and how cuddling is really special, and
I think that's where that's where parents come in. You know, if you give a really good, strong foundation, and that you're with your kids every day, you know, it overrides any other messages that can come through. And yes. I would like the ideological crowd. I would like the ideology to know that, you know.
This is The Black and White Puppy. It's for parents to be able to introduce to their children at a very young age biological facts, truths about the specialness of cuddling, of lying close to another person, and the special nature of the biological relationships between parents and child from before birth. And then the earlier one that I talked about before for little girls, I mean, not little girls, but prepubescent girls, is The Wonder of Becoming You. And like I said, it's been popular even outside of the Jewish community, which really gives me a lot of joy that it's reaching far and wide. So I'm very proud of that first book also.
You should be very proud of all your work, Miriam. It's absolutely fantastic. And fantastic to talk to you today. We'll see how we get on with this campaign, you know, that we would be happy to show this work and show this to educate people, and that they could learn something really useful from it. Yeah.
Jacqui, I really enjoyed this, and I would love to do it again. There's a lot more to talk about.
Yeah. If you would like to get involved in the welfare and protection of your children, please get involved in our campaign and contact us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you so much for watching.